Welcome to Luncheon with Books. It's good to see all of you here, and we have a great program today in store for us. There is one bit of business. Some of you have asked about dues for the Friends of the Library, and now we ask you to pay your dues in January, so it's not coming in all different times of the year. So get your check ready. So anyway, we'll look forward to getting your dues and supporting us in January. Our reviewer today is Brandon Presley, and he is from my hometown, which explains why he is so sophisticated and smart. And he is a great library supporter at the Dorothy Lowe Library in Nettleton. He has been a great supporter, and they have spruced it up, and it is a wonderful, wonderful facility. And I knew that librarian, and she was very dear to me. He also is very interested in preservation, and he has spruced up our hometown, and I do appreciate it. And he had a mural painted on the side of the library, and he put my sister's picture up there. So anyway, I do appreciate that, Brandon. So I've even told some of her friends, and they have driven down to Nettleton to see the mural and to see Kay's portrait. It's beautiful. Well, I guess I should tell you what Brandon does. He is the Public Service Commissioner for the Northern District of Mississippi, and he is doing a fantastic job. We're very proud of you. But I like Brandon because he is a voracious reader. He's been a reader all of his life. He told me that he came to Tupelo to hear Shelby Foote, isn't that right? And the book he is reviewing today is by David McCullough. And you've met David McCullough. That's right. So he's, and Brandon also has been to Sunday school with Jimmy Carter and in Plains, Georgia. And I think, did Steve play the piano?
He just took it over.
It will never be the same. But anyway, Brandon, we're so pleased to have you here. And it's nice to have a politician who reads books. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gratz, and it's so good to be here. This is the first time I've ever had the opportunity, the privilege, to be with the Friends of the Lee County Library for Luncheon with Books. I just want to say real quick to Ms. Gratz, thank you for inviting me to come today. We didn't know when we picked this book. She said, pick what you want to. We didn't know that David McCullough, the author, would pass away just a month ago, and so we had this planned long before then. And so thank you for that invitation. Jeff, to you and your team here that do such a fantastic job at, I think, one of the model libraries for this state and for this country. I don't want this opportunity to go by without me saying thank you for the work that y'all do. And to all the volunteers. My sister's going to have one heck of an estate sale or auction or yard sale when I die, because I have bought almost every book at the book sale over the last years, many years past, when y'all had good deals on good books. And so thank you for that. Libraries are important. They're important to the heart of our community. They send a signal to children, to adults, and really to the business community and the fabric of our society that we value learning. And the book I'm going to talk to you about today, and the two characters that are central to that book, grew up in a household and in an environment in which learning and books and reading were extremely important. I don't know that we could take anything in today's modern society and try to transfer that to a younger generation that could be more important than the love of reading. When my mother passed away, she had some 1,800 books, ranging from the Foxfire series on Appalachian culture all the way to Benedictine monks to C.S. Lewis and everything in between. She would get so caught up in books, she would call characters in the nonfiction books at home, look up their phone number, and ask them a question about it. So I grew up in a culture of reading. And so again, I think libraries are very important. Before I get into the review, let me plug our library just a minute. In Nettleton now, we're home to a 7,300 square foot library in downtown. Steve Holland worked with us, and me and others in the city, to take what he had as a funeral home and turn it into a library. And today, I think we've got one of the nicest small town libraries in the state. We're looking forward to some series of programs down there that we hope will entice our community and invite y'all to be a part of. One of the things Ms. Gratz mentioned a while ago was President Carter. Stanley Godbold, who is a retired professor at Mississippi State, and I were talking this morning. Stanley wrote the definitive biography and just finished the second volume of Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. And so we're working to get him to our library, and we want to invite all the friends of the Lee County Library to come and be a part of his book review and his presentation. This book, I think, is the third in the trilogy of David McCullough's books on infrastructure and major projects that the United States and Americans took over. The first one about the Panama Canal, the second about the Brooklyn Bridge, and then the third in that trilogy on the invention of flight by the Wright brothers. Today in this country, 5,670 flights will occur in the United States of America today. 100,000 flights will occur around the world today, all thanks to two non-degree holding young men from Dayton, Ohio, who just out of pure perseverance and bullheadedness made it a mission in their life to do what nobody else had done and to fly a plane, or a glider as they called it in 1903. I think it's very important in setting the stage for what David McCullough wrote to go to the end of the book, where he says, on July the 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong, another American born and raised in western Ohio, stepped onto the moon, he carried with him, in tribute to the Wright brothers, a small piece from a wing of their 1903 flyer. Orville and Wilbur Wright grew up in a household and in an environment that promoted learning. Their parent, their father, Bishop Wright, who you'll learn about in the book, is a fascinating character, who encouraged them to think outside the box, who encouraged them to be a lifelong learner. And it all came about, the 5 minutes that we spend in school on the Wright brothers, and it's just about 5 minutes. We all come away knowing they're from Dayton, Ohio, and they had a bicycle shop. That's really all we know. We didn't know that they didn't have a college degree. We didn't know until McCullough's book of all the trials and tribulations they went through with no money, with no scientific expertise, that they went through to change what now we couldn't imagine modern travel without flight. We couldn't do it. At the time in which they began this mission, as you might guess, folks laughed and thought, here are these two brothers out here doing all these calculations, doing all this work. They've lost their mind. Parallel to that, and remember, this were the days before the internet, obviously, and before widespread news, we in this country were funding expeditions and inventions to try to capture the air and to try to figure out how flight could in fact work. Octave Chinook, who master engineer, constructed the major bridge in Kansas City over the Missouri River, was one who was involved, never could make it happen. There was another gentleman, Samuel Langley, who was the director of the Smithsonian, got $50,000 plus $50,000 in government money, $25,000 in private donations. Now, this is in the early 1900s, to go out and try to do what the Wright brothers ended up doing. They got zero, not a penny, using their own money, but being two young men raised in a tradition that you had to have a mission in life to do something, that you had to have a mission in life in which to accomplish things. Wilbur Wright comes across to you in the book, not to take anything away from Orville, but Wilbur Wright comes across as a absolute 100% genius. He was the driver behind both of the brothers. And he said one time, there are two ways in which to train a wild horse. One's to sit on the fence and take notes and go back and write a thesis on how you train a wild horse. The other one is to get on the horse. And That was their attitude. As they went down, and I, as what I thought was a somewhat student of history, really wasn't connecting Kitty Hawk, North Carolina with Dayton, Ohio, and they decided and picked out on their own Kitty Hawk because of the winds, the birds, and the soft sand in which they could land those gliders without any type of problem. You imagine a minute, as the book talks about, when they went to the Outer Banks of North Carolina in their three-piece suits, wool suits, and running around with their arms out trying to mock birds. And it led to what you know as that famous photograph. But that's not the whole story. That's not the building of this dream and this mission and this environment that the Wright brothers brought to this country and literally changed the world. A couple of incidents in their lives that I think are very, very important. Obviously, the loss of their mother at a time in which they had to get more and more independence and resilience. But one that's a little twist that you find out in history as you read through these type of events. You and I know that history turns on an eyelash. The slightest little thing changes the whole course of everything. And when Wilbur Wright was a young man playing hockey, he had his teeth knocked out, completely knocked out by a kid named Oliver Hall. And for 3 years, because of not only the deformity that came about with that injury, but just the infection and all the things that had to go about, he spent 3 years reading. 3 years reading. And his spark for wanting to understand flight came during that time. The strange twist to this is, Oliver Hall, living in the same neighborhood with the Wright brothers, committing this atrocity to Wilbur Wright, which then pushed him to stay home and do nothing but read. Oliver Hall ended up being the most notorious mass murderer in the history of the state of Ohio. And think about that in history. Here's two brothers that would change the world, and the spark, maybe not just the spark, but the mechanical time, the way in which there was a period of time that they could learn, came about by someone committing a violent act, whether intentional or unintentional. We don't know that just yet. But then ended up being the most notorious mass murderer in the history of Ohio, and just around the block were the Wright brothers, who changed everything. And they literally changed everything. Wilbur Wright said, "No bird soars in a calm." And I think that is a quote that really encapsulates the Wright brothers and what all that they did and what all that they were able to accomplish over time. The other thing that comes across to you in this book is not only their determination, but all the laughing off that they had to take. That nobody believed this could be done. If it was going to be done, it would be in a scientific experiment like what we were talking about with Mr. Langley or Mr. Chanute. Nobody, no layperson without any formal training could do it. But in fact, guess what? They did. It wasn't without a lot of inspiration from the family. One of the characters in this book that comes across so strong and is lost to history is their sister Catherine. Catherine, through time and time again, through good and bad, continued to encourage her brothers to be on the mission and to complete the mission. She ended up being a school teacher, and the joke was she failed all the prominent city leaders of Dayton, Ohio as a school teacher. She flunked them all. She was a tough cookie, and you get that in the book. In 1907, when Orville Wright crashed at Fort Myers outside of Washington, D.C., she took off from school and went and spent 6 weeks because she knew that his confidence had to be built back up. So the characters in this tale are very, very interesting. Many of them just completely lost to history. And I think that that's something that we have to think about, and we have to take into consideration as we try to take this story as a piece of inspiration for all of us, and to realize that the impossible can, in fact, be possible. The beginning of the book kicks off with a quote that I think is very, very important, back to that environment. This is from Wilbur Wright. "If I were giving a young man advice as to how he might succeed in life, I would say to him, pick out a good father and mother and begin life in Ohio." And why Ohio? Not just for the funny part of it. At that time, Ohio was leading the nation leading the nation in scientific experiments and coming up with new ways to look at life, to look at ways in which modern life could be improved for people. When you looked at the proliferation of just modern conveniences, Ohio was ahead. They were a state that was looking toward the future, and what could they be on the cutting edge of? McCullough's next book is called The Pioneers. Some of you have read The Pioneers, or if you haven't, you ought to pick it up. And it's all about the culture in Ohio before the Northwest Ordinance was adopted, and how what the Wright brothers said was so very important and so very true. It's about that culture of learning and experimentation and taking, I don't want to say take a dare, but to take a challenge and to have a mission in which to do it. They were obviously, as I said, laughed at, received no money, did it all out of their own grit and determination. And it all came to a head on December the 17th of 1903, when that famous photo that's now on the license plates of every tag and car in the state of North Carolina, they took off at Kitty Hawk and literally changed everything we could ever imagine, not only of flight, but what could be done on our own. The interesting part about this book is that when they went back to Dayton and they were telegraphing back, we did it. Success. We took off. It was only 50 seconds, but if they could do 50 seconds, we can now fly anywhere in the world. They knew that what they had could in fact succeed. When they went back to Dayton, nobody believed it. The local paper would not pick it up. The Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the Scientific American, no mention whatsoever. Nobody believed that this was actually happening. And so they went to a little place called Huffman Prairie, which is about 8 to 10 miles outside of Dayton, where they would do flying exhibitions and ask people to come out and look. We are, in fact, doing this. One of the great characters in this book that I found just endearing and, again, just a wrinkle in how things work out was a guy named Amos Root, who had a publication called Gleanings in Bee Culture. He literally was a beekeeper and wrote a publication about keeping bees. But he went to Huffman Prairie to watch the Wright brothers actually do their flying in their glider and to report back that this, in fact, is going on. How ironic is it that the first written publication of flight wasn't by a major newspaper, wasn't even by the hometown newspaper. They would not even send a reporter. The Dayton newspaper would not even send a reporter out to Huffman Prairie to watch this go on because they believed it was a hoax. And here's a little beekeeping guy, they called him the Bee Man in Ohio, who began writing about that. And in 1905, a French delegation came and watched for themselves and said, please come to Le Mans, Wilbur Wright, and show the rest of Europe what in fact is happening. And it was on the 8th day of the 8th month of the 8th year that over 100 people from all over Europe showed up to Le Mans to watch Wilbur Wright do what nobody else thought could in fact be done. By that time, the U.S. press decided to pick up on this and began reporting. The success of the Wright brothers made top fold of every newspaper throughout this country, and the rest is literally history. One of the things I found so impressive was that it wasn't until, I want to make sure I got this right, May of 1910 that the two brothers went up in a plane together. They never would fly in the same glider or in the same plane together, so that if one crashed, the mission would go on. And it wasn't until they had perfected this experiment that they would get in a plane together and fly, knowing that if that plane crashed, there was enough information out there, there was enough learning and experience and scientific experiments done that in fact their dream and their mission could in fact live on. They didn't just invent the machine to fly. I think that's one thing that we come away from. We see that picture at Kitty Hawk, but they didn't just invent the machine. They mastered the art of flying. It's one thing to just simply invent the machine, but to master that art was something in which that nobody else obviously had done, and at the same time, it led to what today we see as our modern mode of transportation. I can't tell you how impressive the determination, the grit, the fact that everyone kind of regarded them as weirdos. I mean, seriously, you think about two bicycle mechanics out telling you they're going to take up in the air. That's something that you wouldn't believe had happened. Amos Root, the guy I told you about that was a beekeeper, wrote this and gave this account of his time seeing the Wright brothers at Huffman Prairie. I found them in a pasture. The few people who occasionally got a glimpse of the experiments evidently considered it only another Darius Green, but I recognized at once they were really scientific explorers who were serving in the world in much the same way that Columbus when he had discovered America. And I think that's right. McCullough goes into such deep detail of not just the experiment, but again, back to the environment that produced this. You know, Orville and Wilbur Wright could have just decided to work on bicycle tires and work on bicycles, but the mission and the determination that they had and the drive to actually do something was what's behind all the things that we know today are such a big part of our modern life. It was a house full of books that produced these two boys, and it was a culture of learning that did it. It was there was a book entitled The Empire of the Air, which came out in 1886, which was one of the books that after Wilbur Wright was hit in the teeth playing hockey that he read. And one of the quotes in the book, and I may butcher this up just a bit, but said, "The desire to master flight is so infectious that once you put this book down, you'll never be able to let it go." And that turned out to, in fact, be true. Now, Orville lived on for a good while and into old age, but Wilbur didn't do it. And he passed away at the age of 45 in that home in Dayton, Ohio. And this is what his father, Bishop Wright, said about him. I've got this printed out on a door that I can see every day in my house after I read this book years ago, because I think that if we all could have our obituary say this, we're in pretty good shape. And this is what his daddy wrote about him. A short life full of consequences, an unfailing intellect, imperturbable temper, great self-reliance as great modesty, seeing the right clearly, pursuing it steadily, he lived and died. I don't know that there could be a more beautiful set of sentences written about anyone, and recognition of how very important the work that they had done, but the character of the people who did it. They weren't cheapskates. They weren't dishonest. They were not out trying to have a hoax in which they got some kind of grant from the Smithsonian or from some private foundation to do this. They intended and succeeded in doing it the right way, from the bottom up, with grit, determination, and sweat. And today, as I said, 100,000 flights will take off around this globe today, thanks to the work that they did. McCullough said that in an interview I watched with him, that he wanted to tell this story because of what I just mentioned earlier, that we spend 5 minutes on it in education today. 5 minutes on something in which changed the course of our world and our future. And the question was, how would the Wright brothers feel today knowing that their invention dropped the bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima? How would they feel today with the bad things, that it was their invention that flew into 2 World Trade Centers? So we know that, just like anything else, that as these things come on to the fore, they can be used for good or bad. I think the good completely outweighs the bad when it comes to the airline industry and the mastery they did of flight. But every time you go to an airport, every time you see that plane come over, I think it's important to realize and to remember that we have that convenience today thanks to a culture of learning created in a household. No electricity, no plumbing, no telephone, no nothing, but a house full of books that gave a spark of inspiration after an awful, violent attack, a spark of inspiration that set these 2 young men off on a course to achieve what nobody else could achieve. And sometimes I'm scared that that's lost. I'm scared that spark that you see is gone in many of our young people today. But there's a lot of folks still got that gleam in their eye. And there are a lot of wonderful, wonderful adventures and thoughts and missions like the Wright brothers had that we can encourage going forward if we continue to push and continue to advocate for lifelong learning, not giving up on what you feel as if your mission is. And I think that that comes through extremely clear in this book, and I think looking at that in the face of every type of adversity that one could think of, it makes such a huge difference. So I'm glad to share a part of this story with you today. I don't want to go over my time. I told Ms. Gratz that I'm very cognizant of that because I've been ran out of Rotary clubs for talking too long. But I wanted to share a few thoughts with you. If you haven't picked this book up, I promise you it's an easy read, but it's a very good read. And I think it gives you an insight to a period in American history that we just don't know a whole lot about. And it also gives us an insight into these two wonderful people, but also the characters that come through. Their father and their mother is absolutely astounding. We all know nobody does anything alone. And it is the basis of that support group and network that helps to foster those dreams and those missions. And so thank you for letting me share this with you today. I'll be glad to take any of your questions. Yes, ma'am. First up.
Meeting David McCullough.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was at, I had always wanted to meet Mr. McCullough. He had a great joke that he was in the grocery store one time, and somebody came up to him and said, "That voice, I've heard that voice somewhere." And he said, "Were you the narrator for the Ken Burns Civil War series?" He said, "I was." He said, "Well, I want you to know this. I was suffering from extreme insomnia during this period, and I would listen to you every night to go to sleep." So a lot of us had our introduction to David McCullough really from the Ken Burns series on the Civil War, mini-series on the Civil War. And so I had, read Truman. I had read Mornings on Horseback about Teddy Roosevelt. I think John Adams, the book he won a Pulitzer Prize for, is one of the Pulitzer Prize, won it on Truman too, was just absolutely amazing. We all know who John Adams is, but we didn't know in depth about him or John Quincy Adams. And so I was very interested in him. I was actually at Harvard for a weekend retreat event, and I had alerts set up in Google. So if David McCullough came up, I got an email said, boom, there's an article out. We politicians want to monitor everything that's said about us, but particularly on things we're interested in. So I just got to my hotel that night, flights in the morning at 6 o'clock, phone pops up, David McCullough to sign books at the original Brooks Brothers store in Boston, in the Back Bay. And so I thought, how much is it going to cost to swap these flights, because I knew that I was going to take a later flight out of Boston. And luckily, I was able to do that. And he came to sign it was not the Wright brothers. I think he came to sign 1776. That was they had done a reemergence of that and were promoting that in a little bit of a tour. And he and his wife, Rosalie, were there, two of the most charming, nice people that you could ever meet in your life. And so I count that as a little bit of a crest for me in getting to meet some of the historians that you care so much about. You mentioned about Shelby Foote. I think I illegally drove up here that night. I'm serious. I don't think I had a driver's license. But I drove and parked 2 blocks over and walked. And so, it's those sort of moments where you connect not only the writing and the historians, but really to a person. And luckily in both those instances, it turned out to be as great.
The first Helen Foster lecturer was Warner Von Braun. So
Really? I didn't know that. Wow. Warner Von Braun, scientist, rocket engineer. Yeah, that's amazing. Yes, ma'am.
Back to the Wright brothers, did they profit in any way from their endeavor?
They were wonderful scientists and awful businessmen, because many of the things that they did not, for instance, patent a lot of things. And I don't know if that was intentional or non-intentional, because, if you think about what they were doing as a mission, as driven by really a passion, I don't think money was their passion. It was not to be profiteering off of what they spent all this time working on. Now, have no fear, they ended up pretty well in life, and you can look at, where Orville Wright lived later on, beautiful home in Ohio. But I don't think it was anything akin to Jeff Bezos inventing Amazon. I think it was they were just more intent on offering this to the world, proving to themselves that you could take an impossible problem that everybody else said couldn't happen. And again, people all over the globe were trying this and crashing and doing all of this, and they continued through it. I mentioned earlier that Orville had a crash at Fort Myers, and it killed a soldier in the plane with him. And the Sister Catherine knew that this was such a devastating event that he would give up continuing to promote this, that she got a pause in teaching school and went and spent 6 weeks with him. So I think if you look at the nature of those events and the fact they used their own money and they were not out like a snake oil salesman trying to run around and promote, I think that there could be some actual intention not to just completely profiteer off of what they were doing. Sure didn't say, you get nothing in the book that makes you feel like the character of these two men was to somehow go out and make a lot of money. Think about it. Wilbur died at the same house there in Dayton, and this is after he had flown everywhere. So, no, sir, no. Wilbur Wright died of typhoid fever. Their father, Bishop Wright, for years warned them about the water. Boil the water, boil the water, and that was hitting everywhere, and that is what ended up killing Wilbur Wright. Was typhoid. Yes, sir.
If I remember right, when they were first trying it at Kitty Hawk, they had to lug, drag this heavy glider back up the sand dune.
Yes, sir.
Does McCullough say how many attempts they made before they actually succeeded?
I'm sure it's in there. I don't remember. They had, I would say conservatively, a dozen. I think it's what I remember. And
it was over and over.
Oh yeah.
And finally got not the plane change so much as just learning how to control it.
That's and back to the art of flying, not just the machine, not just the machine with the motor, but the art of in fact flying that. And I think one of the funniest scenes in the book is where those folks from the Outer Banks of North Carolina are thinking, who are these guys showing up out here, three-piece suits, running around, tilting with the wind, trying to figure out how this is working. But they came to love them because they respected their work ethic. And so they, once they kind of got through the preliminary shock of these two young men running around the sand dunes, they realized they keep coming back, and they're not giving up on what it is they're trying to do. And so it's you're right, hauling that glider back up time and time again to try to perfect this. And to your point, not making a dime out of it, just simply wanted to prove to themselves that they could solve this problem. Yes, sir, Brother Roy.
I'm sure all of us in here remember our first flights, and I think my first one was from Tupelo to Atlanta, and back then in the 50s, we had the old leftover planes from World War II, and how many of you remember the type of planes we had from Tupelo to Atlanta back in the 50s? Yeah. And the second thought is, the first time I flew in a jet was from Memphis to Atlanta, and I remember thinking, we had barely gotten up in the air, and the pilot came on and said, we're making our approach into Atlanta.
Right. In the first gliders at Huffman Prairie, think about this, in 1903, they went 20 miles in 12 minutes. 20 miles in 12 minutes. Now, obviously that's a lot faster than it was today. And then, obviously today is much faster than it was then. But still, what an amazing thing for people to watch. I found this quote that I think goes to the heart. Orville Wright said, we had to go ahead and discover everything ourselves. We had to do it all ourselves. And to me, that's what continues just to push throughout this entire book. And we only spend 5 minutes on it in public education or private, in any education today about these two brothers. I'm so proud that McCullough decided to take this up and got it to the world, obviously before he passed away.
It tells you everything about it, but if you ever get a chance to go to Kitty Hawk, it's a great thing.
Yeah, I've never been.
It's one.
Yeah.
They have, because we have a historic things, the country does a thing there.
Yeah, so is it like a national park then? Yeah, I want to go to Huffman Prairie, and see where all this went, because it would be like somebody in Shannon having some invention that changes everything, and it's just down the road from us, and nobody in Tupelo or Nettleton or Verona believed it was happening, and they're out there every day showing what it could be. And what a twist that Mr. Root is the guy that got that publication to the world when no other newspaper believed that it would in fact happen. And they begged them to come and watch. And the local paper would not even spend time to send a reporter out there. Just outside of Dayton, about 8 miles outside of Dayton. And just my understanding, I think, from the book is about the size of 3 football fields. Just enough to land, take off, and show people what could happen. And you know that had to be such a big day when they went up together. You know, never would do that. And then here they are decided, you know what, if it crashes, it crashes. We've done it. And I think that's probably the signal they sent to everybody is that we've done it. I don't blame her. I don't blame her. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
It's not related to this book, but the buzz around Tupelo is that you're running for governor.
Oh, Lord. I think I'm going to be running for the truck after that question. I'm going to be running for the truck. I tell people in politics I don't even buy green bananas. I'm scared I won't be around when they get yellow. So
This would be a great place to announce.
I'm going to disappoint you today. I'm going to disappoint you today. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just have a couple comments.
Sure.
Thank you for pronouncing Pulitzer correctly.
Okay.
My mother was a journalist and wrote for them.
I
okay? So
understand.
That's how, it is Pulitzer, right? Also, my dad worked on the Manhattan Project.
Really?
And that was over. He was an engineer. Well, I wasn't born yet, but I was born in Dayton because that was his next job. And I recall being about this tall, and he was an engineer. All the guys made things all the time, and one of his friends owned the bicycle shop.
Wow.
And we went over there, and it was just like anybody else's garage.
Right.
And I think I read that it was lost to urban renewal in the 60s.
Wow.
But it seemed like somebody should have picked up on it. But I need to verify that.
Yeah.
I should really check.
I think they recreated it in a museum in Dayton.
Well,
Maybe that was
could be.
you know,
Yeah.
welcome to our world where,
Yeah, Western
something-
Avenue, all that was just,
yeah.
no.
So did your dad go to Los Alamos to work? Okay, all right.
We were,
That's another fascinating book, 106 Palace Avenue. If you ever hadn't picked that up, pick it up. It's about how the scientists were ushered into Santa Fe, New Mexico under this secret code, and I've been able to go to that little office where, and then they would take them up to Los Alamos. So.
They all have the same address.
Yep, 106 Palace Avenue. Yep, and it's a small little office about the size of that kitchen. You'd check in, and 4 or 5 traffic routes later, somebody in a certain car would pick you up and carry so nobody could know what you're there for. I'm chasing a rabbit on that, but it's just interesting.
Good rabbit.
Yeah, it's a good rabbit to chase. Well, y'all, thank you very much. It's just great to be with you. Thank you again for what y'all do for our library. I know Ms. Gratz and I were talking about how tough it's been post-pandemic to get things back up and going. And I'm proud and thankful that y'all are doing that to continue to sow these seeds in our community. Yes, sir, Brother Ryan.
We want to thank you for the excellent job you have done as our commissioner.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, you're mighty kind to say that.
I know from personal experience that when you call your office, you get some action.
Well, that's what we're there to do, and so we encourage you to call with any problem you got. We're glad to try to, if we can't solve it, we'll try to get you to the person that in fact can. So that's what you pay me to do, and that's what you pay those folks in the office to do. Thank y'all again very much.
Thank you for coming out today, and Evelyn Croxton, thank you for playing the piano. The music was lovely. Thank you. We hope to see you next month. It will be the 4th Wednesday in October. And anyway, come back out. We'll have a very good program for you.